Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker, coming to you with a massive show tonight, right? Really, really big. We're talking about what could be the UK's Gilets jaunes moment. I hope I pronounced that right. Ash, you've been out talking to angry farmers today. Are you feeling energized? Are you feeling angry?
I'm feeling knackered. It was raining all day, Michael, but I did appreciate you giving it the full GCSE French pronunciation on Gilets jaunes. Où est la piscine? That's what I want to know.
Où est la piscine? Who is at the swimming pool? Maybe? I've got no idea. I need to do Duolingo on French. Gilets jaunes, just as I said that, I'm like, Gilets jaunes actually was about petrol prices, wasn't it? This is about inheritance, so potentially sort of a little bit, less of populist potential, because inheritance affects far fewer people than petrol. But anyway, we will be discussing that later. We'll also be covering updates from the Russia-Ukraine war. And this is really interesting. The Amsterdam Mayor backtracking on her claims that racist football fans were subject to a pogrom in her city. So we've talked about this before. You know what I'm talking about. It's those Israeli ultras. They go to Amsterdam. They cause a huge ruckus. Some people fight back. And suddenly everyone's saying this is the worst thing since 1930s Germany, right? So the mayor now, after some pushback, I think probably from the people of Amsterdam saying, why have you smeared us in this way? She is completely backtracked. Really interesting clip, and we'll be looking at the end. I'm joined by a special guest live from Los Angeles, Ana Kasparian. How's it going?
It's going well. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
And I'm sure all of our audience already knows Ana Kasparian. She's the executive producer and host of The Young Turks, an incredibly popular US news show. It's always been a bit of an inspiration for us. We're always trying to catch up with you over there. So thank you for joining us. I suppose I wanted to get you on to catch up to see how you guys are feeling 2 weeks after the second election of Donald Trump. What's your mood? How are you feeling?
Well, in terms of the shock of Trump winning a second term, I didn't really feel much of that shock. I kind of saw it coming, to be quite frank. But I do feel that a lot of people on the left really did think that Kamala Harris was, going to sweep the swing states and beat Donald Trump, especially with all of the, terminology used against Trump that was scary, meant to fearmonger, to be quite honest. And I just knew it wasn't going to work because there were real concerns and frustrations that were being communicated by voters again and again. And I felt that those concerns were being ignored. Economic concerns, some concerns having to do with immigration and crime. And I think that Trump actually managed to run a very successful campaign in terms of messaging. And I think that the way he campaigned this time around was really underestimated from beginning to end. And I think people are starting to wake up to what the Democrats got wrong and how they really do need to recalibrate their messaging, but more importantly, the policies in which they choose to focus most of their energy. And, I have a theory that the Democratic Party, which used to be thought of as the party of FDR, the party that looks out for the working class, has become less so because of the, corporate capture of the party through limitless corporate campaign donations to Democratic politicians. Obviously, Republican politicians enjoy that as well. But as you have this two-party system where both sides become more and more similar to one another on the bread and butter issues, the way they differentiate themselves tends to be some of the cultural or social issues. And what I've noticed is, the Democratic Party or the left in general has gotten more and more extreme with some of those policy stances. And they kind of missed the fact that there were voters in a lot of Democratic strongholds who did not like these policies and really were hoping that Democrats would change course, but they refused to do so. So it was really a double-edged sword. You had the fear of re-electing someone like Donald Trump, but on the other hand, you had this very real frustration among working class voters. They felt that their needs weren't being met. And then on top of that, the issues that Democrats tended to harp on, not just during Kamala Harris's campaign, but for years prior to her campaign, were the types of issues that impacted such a tiny group of people. I think voters were just confused, befuddled why all of this attention was being paid to cultural issues that really didn't impact a broader base of Democratic voters.
And I suppose one of the reasons I was most interested to talk to you today is because obviously we're in an interesting situation as journalists, in the sense that it's very unusual for a president to get elected for a second time, not re-elected, but elected for a second time, and let alone a politician as unusual as Donald Trump. And I suppose in my head, I've got this sort of script, which is Donald Trump gets elected, everyone's completely shocked, sort of the media gets a little bit hysterical, understandably. You have these huge marches, the resistance grows. Channels like your own would have sort of, I imagine, sort of got a lot of traction in that moment because everyone was feeling sort of very politically frustrated, angry, confused. I suppose I want to know, how different does it feel this time around, 8 years later? And I suppose, how do you think you're going to be approaching this differently? Because I know you've also been on a bit of a political journey yourself.
Yes, I'm definitely approaching Trump's second term differently in that I'm much more skeptical of corporate media narratives about what he's up to or what his administration is going to do. There have been stories published in The Atlantic, for instance, that have been completely debunked in regard to things that Donald Trump allegedly said behind the scenes. And then you find out, other individuals in the room heard something entirely different. So, when I come across these stories with unnamed sources, it doesn't mean that the story isn't credible, but I'm a little more skeptical and I tend to wait a little longer before analyzing or commenting on something that he's been accused of doing or something that he's going to implement. But more importantly, I think what has happened with me is that I no longer view the Democratic Party as the party that has the moral high ground on anything, to be quite frank. I mean, what has happened in Gaza, in the West Bank, now in Lebanon, has happened under a Democratic president's watch. Joe Biden and Kamala Harris refuse to show even an ounce of humility or an ounce of willingness to change on the issue of their unwavering support toward Israel, regardless of what that Israeli government carries out. And so that really soured me on the Democratic Party, because how are you going to tell me that you care about marginalized people, people of color, all of this, when the Democratic administration is currently overseeing the slaughter of so many innocent civilians in Gaza, and he refuses to change course. He refuses to see this as the incorrect course of action. And really, I just really soured on Democrats after that. But then on top of this, issue, you have the Biden administration really nickel and diming the American people when it came to his own agenda, his own presidential agenda. And when I say he's nickel and diming, I'm really talking about how Biden empowered some of the corporate Democrats in the Senate to essentially torpedo some of the economic policies that would have really benefited working Americans, including an extension of the child tax credit. He allowed it to expire. That is going to have a very negative impact on the perception that voters have toward the Democratic Party. And then on top of that, they just keep digging their heels more and more on incredibly unpopular social issues, including, this ongoing nonsense about how we need to be soft on crime because prosecuting people who have committed violent crimes so supposedly doesn't work, except it does. And when you don't prosecute and you just allow people, to get booked on violent crimes again and again and again, and you just keep releasing people out on the streets without any real plan, any real rehabilitation, people are going to start getting angry. And I found myself in that camp.
And I suppose when it comes to Trump, I mean, I tuned into your show the other night. I can't remember exactly what day it was, but I was a bit taken aback by how sort of, I suppose, relaxed you seemed. Sort of, I think you were talking about RFK Jr. being nominated to be health secretary. And, you and Cenk were both talking about, your colleague Cenk Uygur, we were talking about, all of the really dodgy, crazy positions he had. But then it's also saying, yeah, but he's got a point here and there, when it comes to the power of big pharma, for example. Maybe he's got a point. Maybe let's see how it goes. And I suppose, are you really sort of approaching the next 4 years with, I suppose, let's give Trump the benefit of the doubt? I mean, is that fair to say? Well,
I mean, what choice do we have? The Democrats, can I curse? I don't know if I can.
You can curse. The
Democrats, yeah, they got their asses beat. I mean, Donald Trump is the first Republican president since 2004 to not just win the Electoral College, he won the popular vote. Democrats need to wake up. And so the way that I see it is, okay, I can scream and shout and have a temper tantrum on every episode of The Young Turks over the fact that Donald Trump got elected. And as someone who won the popular vote, he's got a lot more political capital to choose who his appointments will be, choose which policies he's going to pursue. It's not like he was hiding the ball. He campaigned consistently on specific issues, including, the tariffs, of course, including, wiping out the administrative state in our federal government, firing a bunch of, career staffers and administrators. And he's, of course, talked about the mass deportations. It's not like he hid any of that. And so who am I to have a temper tantrum over the fact that the vast majority, not the vast, but the majority of American voters decided to cast their ballots for the guy who didn't hide the ball and was honest about what he wanted to do? Do I like Donald Trump? I don't. I don't like Donald Trump. I think we're in for 4 straight years of complete and utter chaos, and I'm not looking forward to that. But honestly, my ire right now is directed toward the Democratic Party. They did this. The fact that they were unable to beat Donald Trump should give them some pause to really reevaluate the way that the electorate perceives them. And people are angry. And for the first time, I have to be honest, I feel that anger. I understand that anger. The only difference is, what grounds me are my values. And so I look at what Donald Trump is offering, and he's selling a bill of goods that I have no interest in. But what exactly does the Democratic Party stand for? And so I think a lot of voters feel alienated. A lot of people who cast their ballots for Joe Biden did not show up to vote on Election Day. And that communicates something incredibly important to the Democratic Party. And unless they realize that their love affair with corporate America is really damaging their brand and their ability to win elections, they're going to keep losing. And that's their fault.
And I suppose let's separate sort of the electorate and what they think from what you think as an individual. And I know sort of one of the issues that is put forward, I think very understandably, sort of why Donald Trump is sort of qualitatively different from the Democrats is his sort of approach to democracy, and his sort of disrespect for democracy and his sort of willingness 4 years ago to try and overturn it. And I know sort of before the election, there was a very viral clip of you and your colleague Cenk sort of debating whether or not Trump was a fascist. I thought you both put forward your positions very effectively. There were lots of people online trying to dunk, as they do, but I thought it was an interesting conversation. But to get to my question to you, you were on the sort of side of he's not a fascist. What could change? What could he do, say, when he does get inaugurated in January that would make you think, okay, this is different? This is the time to start screaming again, I suppose.
Well, I mean, if and when he dismantles actual, government institutions that are specifically meant to check him and his administration, which, I am a little bit concerned about that, especially considering what Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy have promised to do as part of this like fake made up government department, the Doge department.
Doge, yeah.
To get rid of certain government waste, as they put it. But I suppose the thing about Trump to keep in mind is that, he doesn't have what I think a fascist would need in order to carry out like a fascist state. I mean, he doesn't have, a militarized citizenry that just came back from war and is angry and frustrated and willing to, do some real damage and carry out whatever's in the best interest of Donald Trump. Sure, he has his supporters, but I will say that they seem different mood-wise and behavior-wise this time around compared to 2016. In 2016, it really did feel like there was a growing group of young men, who were causing all sorts of problems. You had that hate march in Charlottesville. And I didn't know if that was going to continue growing into something that we needed to be concerned about. But maybe it's because Trump won so handily. People seem a lot calmer this time around. There was a small hate march of like a dozen people who were chanting disgusting anti-Semitic things. But as far as I know, it wasn't associated to Donald Trump or his electoral win at all. So, Trump says a lot of dumb things that he doesn't ever really carry out. And so it's interesting when pundits decide to take him at face value and when they decide that he's lying. When he's saying things that he's going to do to allegedly, help American workers, oh, you can't take him at face value, he's lying. But when he says some of the unhinged things, oh, he's definitely telling the truth, take him at face value. So I don't know. We have to wait and see. He won the election fair and square. And whether I like that or not, he's going to serve 4 years. And, I'm going to take each day as it comes and be as fair as I can with how he runs this government.
And I suppose, what do you think happens to the left? I mean, we could talk about sort of independent media, we could talk about street protest, but there was really it was called the resistance, wasn't it? I mean, I'm not sure quite what your relationship to the sort of quote unquote resistance was back then. But are we going to see the same sort of things? So do you expect to see sort of a big women's march or sort of this sort of outpouring of popular reaction to Donald Trump? Or do you think because he won the popular vote, people are sort of going to say, okay, he is, until proven otherwise, we will just treat him as a normal, legitimate president?
The energy is very different this time around. And I think it has more to do with the demographic shift toward Trump more than the fact that he won the popular vote. What empowered the left, and when I say left, I mean broadly speaking, that includes the resistant liberals, that includes leftists, so everyone on the left. What empowered them, I think, after he won the first time, was that the Democratic Party's narrative about him being this horrible racist, Islamophobe, it rang true, especially when you looked at the electorate and who voted for him in 2016, who didn't vote for him. This time around, he has managed to increase his support, certainly among the Latino population, certainly among Black males. With Latino women, they still voted for Kamala Harris. A majority of them voted for Kamala Harris over Donald Trump. But Donald Trump had definitely increased his support among Latino men. And when you listen to what they have to say, what persuaded them to go with Trump is the economy, right? The fact that they felt left behind by the Biden administration. If you listen to some of the New York Times interviews of Latino men who live in Texas border states, a lot of them were upset about how out of control the border was. And it's because they're worried about their own jobs being taken by migrants who don't have documented status yet. And their labor can definitely be exploited for even lower than minimum wage. And so these are very real bread and butter concerns that were completely neglected by the Democratic Party. So I think the approach this time around, I'm hoping the approach this time around is a little bit of humility and self-reflection. Because if you don't have a popular message and if you're not pursuing popular policies that actually improve people's lives, they're not going to vote for you.
And so, I mean, in your responses, you've talked a lot about Democrats on cultural issues, things such as migration, crime. I suppose the pushback you get from people is to say one, I suppose you're sort of jumping on Republican or right-wing talking points, and two, Kamala Harris did actually run, a fairly centrist campaign when it came to those issues, right? So she said, "I have a gun." She wasn't saying we're going to open up the border. There was a period where she was kind of positioning herself as Kamala the cop. So I suppose when people on sort of the progressive side are looking at this campaign and saying, the problem was the cultural issues, people are saying, well, it actually seems like the issue was economic here. Why are we using this moment to talk about these cultural concerns that some people may or may not have?
It was both. I mean, I think front and center were the economic issues. But what compounded the anger and frustration were the social issues. So I'll explain. I'll explain in more detail. So when inflation hits and Americans who are already struggling are struggling even more because they have to pay more for just the essentials, right? I mean, everything from, the price of gas, the price of groceries, the price of car and home insurance, everything shot up. So you're dealing with that. And of course, voters are going to blame the administration that's in charge. And it was also infuriating listening to the quarterly investors calls that executives were having. And in those calls, they were just flat out admitting that they were engaging in price gouging consumers. They were able to jump on the inflation bandwagon that was spurred from like supply chain issues and claim that they were impacted by them in order to increase their profit margins. So that's happening. And that's a very real, problem that American households are facing. And then on top of that, you see dysfunction in your local communities, you see dysfunction at the border. And as that dysfunction is taking place, what you're hearing from Democrats over and over again is crime isn't as bad as it was in the 90s. So don't complain. No, it's not too bad. It's not too bad. Like there was a lot of gaslighting that took place. And when it comes to the, Trump campaign's anti-transgender ad, right? There's been a lot of talk about that. And I think the left is totally misinterpreting why that ad was as effective as it was. And I do believe it was effective. There was some analysis in regard to what percentage of viewers actually watched the entirety of that ad instead of clicking away from it. And it was like upwards of 80%, if I remember the number correctly. So the reason why it was so successful wasn't because of the transphobia. It was that the ad highlighted the priorities of the Democratic Party. And so it feeds into the anger and frustration that Americans are feeling about their economic situation, their personal finances, what's happening with household income. Because rather than focusing on making the economic situation better for Americans, they see Kamala Harris and the Democratic Party overall as the party that's like hyper-focused on a tiny slice of the population. And more importantly, getting taxpayer resources to that tiny population of people, even if they're undocumented and even if they're detained as a result of breaking the law or crossing the border illegally. That's the reason why it was such a powerful ad. And I think that maximalism on the left when it comes to these social issues is not helpful. I don't think it's helpful to have, college-educated elites speak on behalf of the entirety of the Black population, because if you look at the poll results, you'll see that the majority of Black voters did not want to defund the police, but it didn't matter. The elites in the Democratic Party knew better than them, I guess. And so they ignored these voters and continued pushing for policies that were unpopular. And now the chickens have come home to roost. So I think the social issues only further compounded the frustration that voters are feeling about their economic situation.
And finally, I want to ask a question. This is almost a self-interested question because we also have a YouTube channel where we're putting out videos. And I know it's sort of partly from what I've been hearing you've been saying on podcasts and stuff, you want to be a bit less certain, a bit less shouty, a bit less, he said something stupid, everything's terrible, right? And it is the model of sort of YouTube shows and sort of thumbnails. If you put a thumbnail out that says, this guy's a complete idiot. Oh my God, what she said now, everything's going to shit, right? That is what performs quite well. So, I mean, do you have a strategy for how I know you want to sort of, I've heard you sort of say you think in the past you sort of fed into polarization and now you want to sort of mitigate against it a little bit. Can that work on YouTube?
I mean, we're going to find out because that's what I want to do. And I'm going to stick to that plan. Mostly because I just respect my audience more than I wouldn't say I didn't respect the audience previously. I didn't realize that I was feeding them slop, but that's what it was. It was slop. And it was kind of like this unconscious thing that I think a lot of content creators fall into, because whether you like it or not, like to some extent, the algorithm influences like story selection and what you're going to talk about. But I don't really see how it's helpful to my audience to like engage in gossip or online conflict and drama. Like there's a lot of that going on. I get that the algorithm, tends to favor that type of conflict. But I think that this country is in a lot of trouble. And I don't think that a single person can change the world or change a country. I think organized labor and I think, motivated voters who are willing to work together is the only way that you can change anything systemic in this country. However, I will say, I'm responsible for whatever small role I play in the world, and I want to try to do better. And rather than, target individuals, in some cases, even just random private citizens and civilians. I would just rather focus on, the systemic issues at play, the elites and what they're getting away with behind the scenes while we're getting distracted by other nonsense. I'm hoping that, the work I do serves a much better purpose than what I was doing before. I think a lot of people have misinterpreted that as me, like abandoning the left and, trying to lure in the right. I'm not proud of some of the work I've done, especially around COVID, around 2020. I think I got some stories wrong, and it was because I was in an echo chamber. So my goal is to find ways to bring people together, even if they have political differences. And the only way you can do that is to approach everything from a place of compassion and understanding, and also knowing that, this project that we're doing, this experiment we have in the United States isn't going to work unless we have open minds and are willing to hear people out instead of assume the worst, assume malice because they disagree.
Ana Kasparian, thank you so much for joining us on tonight's show. Always great to get you on.
Thank you. My pleasure.
The nation's farmers are furious at the Labour government, and around 20,000 of them have descended on Westminster to let ministers know how they feel. Crowds gathered in Whitehall and Parliament Square, with farmers travelling to London from around the UK by coachload and by tractor. There were the usual placards and banners, but there were also farm vehicles and animal costumes. There was even a Farmers of the Future protest. You can see children on toy tractors pedalling through Parliament Square. It was generally a pretty peaceful affair, but that doesn't mean the farmers aren't very angry. They're protesting changes to inheritance tax announced in Chancellor Rachel Reeves' budget in October. According to the new rules, farms will be liable for 20% inheritance tax for any value above £1 million. That's half the standard inheritance tax rate of 40%. But farmers will also be able to take advantage of zero inheritance tax on properties up to a value of £375,000, meaning no tax will be paid on farms up to the value of nearly 1.4 million. And then if you factor in allowances for spouses, as well as tax-free allowances for children inheriting main residences, the government says a couple could still pass on a farm worth £3 million to their children tax-free. The long and the short of it is £3 million seems like a lot of untaxed wealth. So why are the farmers so upset? Well, we sent my colleague Ash Sarkar down to the protest to find out. This is what she came back with.
This government are a bunch of avocado-munching, London-centric arsemongrels who wouldn't know a hedge if it jumped up and bit them on the bum. They wouldn't know a 5-bar gate if they saw one. They do not understand country people, and I am, as you can tell, furious.
Some people might hear, okay, £1 million in assets or 2 or 3, that sounds like quite a lot.
It isn't. If you live in Cumbria, £1.5 million is your farmhouse. £250,000 is every barn, because in theory you can get planning permission to convert it, which they won't do because they're farmers and they want to feed the nation. Your land is worth way more because types like the ones in the Labour Party will buy it as a second home. And they'll have their 3 acres of pony paddocks, and they won't be paying tax because they can get within the 3 million quid or the 2 million quid or whatever it happens to be. If you've got a proper functioning farm, you're going to be way over £2-3 million. Your stock alone is going to be potentially hundreds of thousands of pounds.
We've got nearly 200 acres, so obviously land is worth money, but we have no money in the bank. But we have
200 acres is quite small for a farm, right?
It is, yeah. But we will be impacted, definitely. We've done the sums, and we're very sad that we have children and we have grandchildren. And, the idea was that it was going to be handed over, and now I think the government doesn't want this. And, we have, all we've done is worked hard. We've done nothing else.
And so, roughly, if you had to pin down what your hourly wage is, how much do you make an hour?
Yeah. Well, pennies. Pennies, yes, yeah.
Do you think that there's any size farm that should pay inheritance tax? Do you think there should be a threshold at all, or should it be a blanket exemption?
I think there should. I think the only people that should pay, I think we should potentially put a cap on large businesses buying farms and getting agricultural property relief. That is wrong. I get that. But if it's been actively farmed, and especially if it's a family farm, no way, they shouldn't pay a penny. But I totally agree with you. Corporations buying up thousands of acres definitely need stopping.
Ash, we're going to talk about a very unpleasant experience you had later in this segment. So let's park that for now. And I want to talk about, these seemed like fairly decent people out protesting, and what you sort of made of the concerns that people were expressing to you out on the demonstration today.
Well, yeah, I mean, we're going to get into the unpleasantness a bit later, but I guess the first thing I want to say is that I did find people to be courteous and very generous with their time, which is always nice when you're out doing vox pops. What I encountered on the march was a real spectrum going from extremes when it came to the size of the farms that people were owning. All right. So on the one hand, I spoke to someone who owned about 150 acres, which is really quite small, all the way up to someone whose family farm was 4,000 acres. Now, that really is massive. And one of the things that it seemed to me to be going on, which is you had objectively very wealthy people using this totemic issue of farmers and inheritance tax, I think, to push a bit of an anti-tax agenda. I think that's one thing that's going on. But something which I heard again and again and again from people is that it's not just about the inheritance tax. So another thing which farmers are going to be hit by, this is going to be the case whether you're a tenant farmer or a farmer who owns their land, is the tax on fertilizers. And another really big deal is the fact that farmers as a whole have lost out on EU subsidies because we are no longer a member of the EU. And the forms of grant giving that was supposed to take their place, not all of that has come through. So for some farmers, they've spent the money that was supposed to come through in the form of conservation grants, and then the next lot of money just wasn't going to come. So there is a broader picture there of farmers going, well, our profit margins on farm produce are quite small. So for every pound you or I spend on food at the supermarket, the farmer gets 15 pence. That's very small. And you've had the disruption in terms of the policy which is being made in Whitehall, which has made it more difficult for them to plan. And then along comes this inheritance tax issue. So on its own, I don't personally think that the inheritance tax is that bad. I think that maybe what you could do is you could adjust the threshold. So the threshold could go up, or you judge it by acreage rather than land value, all sorts of things you could do. But it's the fact that you've got very rich people who are able to sort of pile in behind farmers because lots of rich people bought farmland to try and avoid having to pay inheritance tax. And you've also got this broader picture of what's been going on with subsidies and other forms of financial hardship for farmers.
On the theme of very rich people who bought farms to avoid inheritance tax, amongst the farmers at this demonstration was Jeremy Clarkson, who had this interaction with BBC Newsnight.
Why are you here, Mr. Clarkson?
Well, because I'm here to support farmers.
Right. Are you angry?
It's difficult to be angry on somebody else's behalf. That's like being... Yes, no, I'm not angry on someone else's behalf.
Right. So it's not about you. It's not about your farm and the fact that you bought a farm to avoid inheritance tax.
Classic BBC there. Classic.
Is it?
Oh, yeah. It's not the fact that I bought a farm to avoid inheritance tax. The fact.
You told the Sunday Times in 2021 that's why you bought it.
These people.
Sorry?
BBC.
He did tell the Sunday Times that that's why he bought a farm, right? And he's challenged on it. They just says, the BBC, classic BBC. One of the farmers Ash spoke to had something to say to people like Jeremy Clarkson.
I'm not a city banker, but let's imagine for a second I was. Yeah. Right? I'm a city banker. I'm like, ooh, I fancy some inheritance tax relief. I'm going to buy a farm. What do you think about people who do that?
Yeah, and I think that has been the problem. I think had they not been doing that and taking the mick, I don't think this would have happened. I think they've really, really pushed it and got away with it, and now it's affecting the small guys, and that's not fair. The real farmers, they have definitely been part of the problem, definitely.
So that's really interesting. So what Labour have been saying is the reason we have to close this tax loophole is because it was designed to protect family farmers. And what's actually happening is that very wealthy people are using this to buy up land so that they don't have to pay inheritance tax. And then you've got a small farmer there who presumably didn't buy his farm because he wanted to avoid inheritance tax. He's actually a farmer saying it's these rich guys buying up land who have screwed it up for the rest of us. Some farmers have said that if necessary, they'll go on strike to force an inheritance tax U-turn from the government. But if his past form is anything to go by, Clarkson won't be joining them. After all, this is what he said about people going on strike in 2011.
I'd have them all shot. I would take them outside and execute them in front of their families. I mean, how dare they go on strike when they've got these gilt-edged pensions that are going to be guaranteed while the rest of us have to work for a living?
Ash, I've seen sort of Jeremy Clarkson been described, I've seen journalists sort of say on Twitter that he's a hero amongst these people. And I know you spoke to someone who didn't like him. I've seen other images where it does seem like lots of people do like him on the demo. I mean, what's your take on the sort of the presence of people like Clarkson at a demonstration like this? Very much sort of playing a Nigel Farage man of the people role.
Jeremy Clarkson, the Muad'Dib of the farming community. So just to clarify, the gentleman who I spoke to didn't mention Clarkson by name. He was just talking about a certain kind of person. Clarkson didn't actually come up in any of the interviews that I conducted, so I couldn't say for certain what people felt about him. I suppose what I would say is that there was a much broader, I guess, kind of political disposition, which is, city dwellers don't understand us. BBC, this lot, Labour, they're useless, And that's kind of the vibe that Clarkson speaks to. Even before he bought a farm, that was always his vibe when he was presenting Top Gear. So it doesn't surprise me that there's a kind of cultural or affective alignment there, as well as one in terms of material interests when it comes to the farm itself.
Now, it wasn't just farmers at the protest. Politicians were out in force too, and many of them were from the right.
It made a lot of farmers feel they're not valued for producing food anymore. And now we get this hit on top, which is devastating for the really medium-sized family farms.
This government should be more focused and preoccupied on feeding our country, putting British farmers first, putting British produce first, and actually standing up for our proud British farmers and actually our farming heritage.
Well, morning all. It's Tuesday, it's Farmers' Protest Day. And the weather, like the farmers, like so many of us, are furious at this Labour government.
I've always said Priti Patel is a bit of a camp icon, and I really did like that hat. On more important questions, though, there was also another Reform politician at the protest, MP Lee Anderson. Here's an encounter Ash had with him and his groupies.
Where are you from?
I'm from Novara Media. I was just going to ask, how do you think...
I'm not talking to you. I'm talking to some real people.
Why won't you talk to Novara?
Anyway, communists. Communists.
Yeah? Would you like to
Not what you said.
Would you like to
call yourself a communist?
Sorry, overbreeding of my sort?
No, you're YouTube. There we go. I don't want to speak to you.
Sorry, you said overbreeding of my sort. What did you mean by that? Overbreeding of my sort, sir. You also called me an immigrant earlier.
So that was a man with Lee Anderson, an MP, calling Ash an immigrant. Ash is obviously not an immigrant, and then saying that her sort are overbreeding. Lee Anderson has now responded to that clip. It's just as vile as you would imagine. He says, race baiting again. Here are the facts because you have not included the full conversation. Firstly, the gentleman in the clip told me that he was a farmer and an immigrant. At the same time as I was trying to chat with him, you rudely interrupted. He made it clear that his overbreeding statement was a direct reference to what you actually said. He was being ironic. You have turned it into a race-baiting click. You are disgusting. Utterly shameful. Ash, first of all, I'm sorry you experienced that. And then Lee Anderson has, an elected MP has come out and said that. I mean, do you sort of have a response?
Yeah, I mean, I guess my response was it was a really bad day for all the white reporters to be off on leave, Michael. Where were you guys when I needed you? So I suppose I think the first thing is that, when someone says you're an immigrant, even if he frames it as you're an immigrant like me and you go, no, I'm not, and he doesn't accept that, that's already a race thing. Do you know what I mean? It's like, well, I'm literally not. I was born here. There's nothing wrong with being an immigrant, but I'm not one. So already race has been sort of made front and center by someone putting it front and center. then you've got this thing about overbreeding of your sort, which is just such a loaded comment. Like it really, really is. And I think that if any one of us was witnessing someone say that to anyone, we would go, like, stop that. Do you know what I mean? At a minimum, you would intervene. It might be a soft intervention. It might be a hard intervention. You might intervene, and that's something that Lee Anderson chose not to do. And as he made clear in his subsequent tweets, is because he had no problem with what this gentleman said, and in fact, thinks it's my fault. That's an opinion he's entitled to. All right, of course, that's an opinion that he's entitled to, but he's an elected MP. He's going to be representing people, immigrants and British born, people who are white, people who are not. And for that to be the attitude of an elected MP, I think that's what's shameful. The irony of ironies is that I'm being called a race baiter by Lee Anderson. Other people have said, "Oh, well, you only went to this demo to race bait." I mean, you can go through all of the vox pops I did. Didn't ask anyone about race. Didn't ask anyone about immigration. Didn't ask anyone about ethnicity. And the question that I wanted to ask Lee Anderson was about the impact of losing EU subsidies for British farmers. Again, nothing to do with race at all. I suppose the last thing that I'd say is that it's pretty funny that Lee Anderson has said, "I don't want to talk to you." His producer at GB News has been very keen to get Novara presenters on for his show. So maybe it's a more recent change of heart.
I went on for my sins once. That was the worst request I ever accepted because they made me sit on a different table and it was very embarrassing, but I'd already gone there and I wanted to get paid. But I won't do it again. Ash, I'm going to go to a comment instead of respond to you. Lawrence Bloom says, "Ash, you're a gem and Anderson is a twat." I 100% agree with Lawrence Bloom. Ash, thank you for being so brilliant and for going out and covering that demonstration. And I'm sorry that people are such assholes and that your job is more difficult than mine just because of the color of your skin.
Well, look, I think that I know I said this at the top, but that interaction was really not representative of the interactions that I had with farmers on the demonstration. So even people who I really disagreed with, it was an entirely polite and courteous discussion. That's really great. What that shows is that this cause is attracting the far right in the sense that they want to glom onto it. So it wasn't just this particular individual who was one of Lee Anderson's hangers-on. You also had the leader of UKIP who interrupted one of my interviews to shout at me about Stalin. And you had some people who I think you could quite fairly describe as conspiracy theorists who were there, right? Right-wing conspiracy theorists. So this is a cause which kind of has this gravitational pull, right? And it's pulling other people along. So that's going to be a really important thing to keep an eye on as this develops, right? Is it going to be, a Gilets jaunes moment in terms of the scale of disruption? Is it going to be able to pull in other kinds of disaffection? That's obviously what the Gilets jaunes movement was able to do because it affected fuel prices. Fuel prices affect lots more people, and also it's reflected in food. And will this cause, in particular, become a sort of cause celeb of the far right, who like rich individuals who are hiding behind farmers? Are they going to pile in behind as well because it's politically advantageous for them to be seen as being proximate to people who, I would say enjoy a high degree of trust from the public in general?
Yeah, I mean, I think lots of people are also seeing this as an example to sort of say Labour, city dwelling out of touch, not interested in British traditions and people who aren't from London. US President Joe Biden gave Ukraine permission to use long-range American missiles against Russian territory on Sunday night, and now it appears they may have used them. A source in the Ukrainian military has told a Ukrainian news agency that the country has struck targets inside Russia using the Lockheed Martin-made Attack-M missiles for the first time. The Ukrainian military has officially confirmed they've destroyed a large weapons arsenal, but they haven't formally confirmed the use of the Attack-M missiles. The weapons arsenal hit in the attack is in Karachev, and that's a town in Russia's Bryansk region, located more than 70 miles from the Ukrainian border. It's around 250 miles south of Moscow. The Russian Ministry of Defense has confirmed the attack, but they say 5 of the missiles fired from Ukraine were shot down. They claim a 6th missile was damaged, causing it to shed fragments that started a fire at a military installation. But according to footage posted on a Russian Telegram channel, at least one missile appears to have hit its target. The footage shows a large fireball expanding into the night sky, purportedly in the Russian region of Bryansk. Speaking to reporters in Moscow, Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said this about the attack.
It's a signal saying that they want an escalation, and using these highly technological missiles without Americans. President Putin spoke about this many times. It would be impossible to use them without Americans, and he warned how our position changed if these long-range missiles, 300-kilometer range missiles, will be authorized to use against our country.
In the wake of those strikes, Russian President Vladimir Putin today signed a decree lowering the threshold for the country's nuclear engagement. It now says that an attack from a non-nuclear state, if backed by a nuclear power, will be treated as a joint assault on Russia. So that's being read as a clear reference to the US and potentially UK and France. It adds that an attack involving one member of a military alliance will be treated as an attack by the entire alliance. So that's presumably a reference to NATO. And it also says that a large attack using conventional weapons like missiles or drones, as well as an attack on Russian ally Belarus, could meet the threshold for a nuclear response. So this is some very strong saber rattling. They're saying, everything you're doing currently, this is enough for us to have a nuclear reaction. That doesn't mean they'll do it. Elsewhere in Europe, some suspect Russia of being behind a recent telecommunications attack involving severed undersea internet cables. A 135-mile communications cable running between Sweden and Lithuania was cut around 10 a.m. on Sunday morning. A second 746-mile cable linking Finland to Germany was severed on Monday. Germany's defense minister has now blamed sabotage for the communications disruption. He told reporters this: "No one believes that the cables were accidentally damaged. I also don't want to believe that the ship's anchors caused the damage by accident. We have to assume, without certain information, that the damage is caused by sabotage." The cables ran through the same stretch of water where European officials believe several suspected attacks have taken place, including explosions along the Nord Stream pipeline in 2022. Now, of course, that attack is generally now attributed to Ukrainian forces, not Russia, but I suppose different countries can hang out in the same territory, can't they? The incident occurred as 2 of the affected countries, Sweden and Finland, updated their guidance to citizens on how to survive war. Millions of households in the Nordic nations are set to be given manuals explaining how to prepare for military conflicts, communications outages, and power cuts. Both countries joined NATO following the start of the Ukraine war. Obviously, this is a story I spoke about extensively yesterday at length with Paul Rogers. Of course, unbelievably worrying to sort of have a nuclear power saber rattling like this. Of course, it is a high sort of risk situation to have the United States and NATO essentially helping Ukraine fire missiles into Russian territory. That doesn't mean it's not to some degree justified. Ukraine has been illegally invaded, but I think this analogy is somewhat useful. It's a bit like when the United States invaded Iraq, which again was an illegal invasion, as of course, if then Russia had said, okay, well fine, we'll fire missiles at a military base in America, right? You could argue that would have been justified, but it also would have definitely taken us one step closer to nuclear war. So it's a dangerous situation. Obviously, the upside, the way in which this would be the best it could possibly be is if Ukraine sort of defends a bit of territory, they get into the negotiating room when Trump is president, and Ukraine have a few more bargaining chips, and they can come to some kind of deal which is, to some degree satisfactory to both the Ukrainians and the Russians. Whether or not Putin is going to allow Ukraine to sort of protect their advances until then is a different question. When Israeli football fans chanted racist slurs celebrating the killing of Palestinian children in Gaza and burned Palestinian flags in Amsterdam earlier this month, they weren't welcomed with open arms, and violence broke out. But that's not how Western politicians around the globe framed the clashes. Instead, they shouted, anti-Semitic pogroms. This wasn't football violence, this was anti-Semitic pogroms. One of those global leaders was Amsterdam Mayor, Femke Halsema. So speaking at a press conference the day after the violence, Halsema said this: men on scooters crisscrossed the city looking for Israeli football fans. It was a hit and run. I can easily understand that this brings back memories of pogroms. Our city has been deeply damaged. Jewish culture has been deeply threatened. This is an outburst of anti-Semitism that I hope to never see again. And it was this framing, this was really significant because it was this framing from the Amsterdam Mayor, which is sort of what Western media was generally referencing. So saying, that lots of people, like us were sort of disputing what had actually gone on, but all these Western newspapers were sort of saying, Amsterdam Mayor condemns anti-Semitic violence in her own city. And of course you read that, well, if the mayor of Amsterdam thinks it was anti-Semitic, what reason does she have to lie? But now, Halsema has done something almost unheard of when it comes to Western defenses of Israel. She's withdrawn that framing, instead offering a more nuanced take on the night's events. Appearing on Dutch TV on Sunday evening, Halsema explained what actually happened that night.
Towards 12:30 a.m. approximately, it became clear that something else was going on in the city, meaning that there were not only groups of supporters and others against each other, and that there were incidents surrounding it, but that they spread through the city suddenly. Yes, I called it hit and runs, incidents that were popping up everywhere. I think around 12:30 a.m. It lasted until 2:30, then the city became calm. Only what you then saw is that the image we had, we were totally bypassed by Israel. Because at 3 a.m., Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel gave a press conference about what had happened in Amsterdam while we were still gathering facts.
Die plotseling een lezing gaf over wat er in Amsterdam was gebeurd, terwijl wij nog de feiten aan het verzamelen.
And it shows how effective the Israelis are at PR, right? This happens on the evening. As we know now, just a case of football violence, then Netanyahu is like, I'm going to get ahead of this story. They do a press conference, it sounds like, at 3 a.m. to sort of say this was a pogrom. And then suddenly all of these Western leaders are sort of like, oh God, we've got to comment on this now. And then they sort of just quickly fall into that framing. And then that's the story. Those are the facts. Halsema was asked about her use of the word pogrom in a press conference the day after the violence, how she had used it the day after the violence. And she was asked in this interview whether she would use it again.
Well, first let me say that the words Jew hunt have been used. People were going Jew hunting. They asked for passports. That night and early morning, I spoke to many Jewish Amsterdammers on the phone with lots of emotions. And what I primarily wanted to express was the sadness and fear among Jewish Amsterdammers. But I have to say that in the days after I saw how the word pogrom became very political and turned into propaganda, the Israeli government speaking of a Palestinian pogrom in the streets of Amsterdam. In the political class, the word pogrom is primarily used to discriminate against Moroccan Amsterdammers and Muslims. These were not my intentions, and it's not what I wanted.
Marokkaanse Amsterdammers, moslims, te discrimineren. Zo heb ik het niet bedoeld. Als ik had geweten dat het...
If I had known it would be used this way, politically and as propaganda, I don't want anything to do with that. But I benefited from this. I never made a direct comparison, but said that I could understand the feelings and I wanted to express sadness. But I am not an instrument in a national and international political battle.
Maar ik ben geen instrument in een nationale en internationaal politiek gevecht.
So she's basically saying, not only was I misled, but me being misled led to some very racist consequences, which is that everyone thought, oh my God, this is violence by Muslims. When actually what had happened was a bunch of football violence because a bunch of racist ultras had entered a different city and started shouting racist slurs against Arabs. Later in that interview, Halsema also said she should have mentioned the behaviour of the Israeli fans prior to the game that night, as well as the subsequent violence in Amsterdam. Ash, sort of a couple of things to say about this is, one, fair play, well done to the mayor for sort of coming out publicly and saying she was misled. But it's a bit late, isn't it? Because all the headlines were the day after it happened, and now it's sort of very much a background story.
Well, firstly, not only are the headlines all about that particular narrative, but it's also set the stage for how we understand any future clashes between Maccabi Tel Aviv fans, hooligans, I should say, and people who live in the towns and cities that their football team is playing in. So it was one of those things which took on a life of its own. And then you had people saying, okay, well, any attempt to boycott any Israeli team for any reason, that's going to be, counted as anti-Semitism, and there'll be legal measures taken against it. There was an awful lot of, hot-headed rumors going around in terms of what might happen if Maccabi Tel Aviv play in France. And this became a way to demonize not just the Muslim and North African and Arab communities of Amsterdam, but Muslim, North African and Arab communities across Europe. Became a frame through which to understand their opposition to Maccabi Tel Aviv football hooligans specifically. And Israel as a state which is participating, is carrying out an ongoing genocide more generally. So it did a huge amount of harm, and I think that harm is still ongoing. Like, any retraction and clarification is welcome. But where is the accountability here? And I also think that there is another way of looking at this, which I think goes far beyond just, pro-Palestine advocates and people who are on the left, which is, how is it that a mayor of a city like Amsterdam is being, dragged along by what it is Benjamin Netanyahu says? Why is it that this particular country, Israel, is able to coerce, curtail, and dictate what elected politicians in other countries say and do? How is it that this particular country, Israel, can have such a profound impact on freedom of speech and freedom of expression beyond its frontiers? I mean, just to give you an example of something which has happened recently, in the Canadian Parliament, the Speaker of the House reprimanded a Canadian MP for wearing a watermelon badge and saying that she had to take it off. Now, irony of ironies, the reason why the watermelon became a symbol of Palestine is because the Palestinian flag was banned by Israel, and images which used the colors of the Palestinian flag was banned for many years by Israel on top of that. Just, for me, it's just this basic thing of going, hang on, how is allegiance to another country trumping your own protections for freedom of expression? Now, before anyone jumps in and says, oh my God, Ash, I can't believe that you're calling street violence freedom of expression. No, I'm not. When it comes to understanding what happened in Amsterdam, yes, I think you've got to look at it through the frame that many people there felt very angry at the ongoing genocide. I think that, many felt primed and sort of, up for a confrontation with Maccabi Tel Aviv supporters because they're Israeli. But the thing which catalyzed those scenes of violence that, we all saw in the media and in social media was the rampant destruction, obnoxiousness, and racism of the Maccabi Tel Aviv supporters. Now, I'm sure that people were victims of that violence who were not themselves football hooligans, all right? But that's often how football hooliganism works. Anyone who wears the same shirt as you ends up being considered a fair target. And it's just, if I was the mayor of a city, my first duty of care would be to my city, right? Football hooligans come a distant second to that. A state carrying out a genocide, an even more distant third.
Ash, we should wrap up there because I know you've had an incredibly long day and it's been somewhat eventful and you deserve a good rest this evening. So from all of our audience, from me, thank you for all you do. I hope you have a wonderful, relaxing evening.
It's all thanks with words. It's never Xanax, which is what I've been asking for ages, Michael.
Ask me after the show. Ask me after we stop going live. I'll at least get you a pint. Thank you, everyone, for watching tonight. Come back tomorrow for another show from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.